Today I have Jasmine Mbye of the Like Me Community Interest Company. Jasmine is also a coach, a TEDx speaker, and many other accomplishments that she'll tell us about today. Jasmine, thank you for agreeing to be interviewed today as part of the Inclusion Interviews to inspire inclusion in celebration of International Women's Day.
Thanks for having me. I'm really glad that I could be here today.
And what would you like to speak about today? What is your perspective on how we can inspire inclusive environments?
I think inspiring inclusive environments, I kind of distill it down to us being our authentic selves. And I think, when we have environments in which people are accepted and kind of are expected to be their authentic selves. And I don't say expected in a negative sense, but, sometimes it's treated like a bit of an affront that you would be who you really are. So if we actually expect people to be who they are, as opposed to, I need to be like this to fit in and conform here, and I need to be like this to fit in and conform there, just be able to be a whole person. And I can bring my whole person to those workspaces and places. I think then we're gonna see and experience more inclusivity, because actually I'm me. I may be a woman. I may be a woman with brown skin, as my daughter says. Mummy, we're brown. Whatever the differences may be that we have, if we can just accept people for being authentically them, then we're gonna have much better outcomes all round.
Excellent. And one of the things we were speaking about earlier was the concept. Sometimes what we find at the moment is a lot of labeling of different groups. Now, labeling, sometimes we're taught through training in therapy and coaching, can have negative connotations, but actually there are times where this can be useful and helpful in environments. Could you give us some examples of that, please?
Yes, so literally this week I was speaking at several events, one of which was the PA show, and I was talking about imposter syndrome. And a lady came up to me afterwards and she was like, oh, really great talk. Thank you very much. And she said, I was kind of checking everything off as you were going through the stuff. But she says, one of the things that's really helped me with my imposter syndrome was being recently diagnosed as being on the autistic spectrum.
Yeah.
So this woman, I would estimate, was in her 30s. So she's lived a considerable amount of life feeling different, but unable to explain the difference. So for her, the label of being ASD, on the autistic spectrum, allows her to go, now that makes so much more sense. Why I find certain things more difficult, why I find certain environments more challenging, why I have felt different for a lot, not for all of my life, but in her case. And that's not the only person that I've heard express that. I've met several women who've had late diagnoses of autism in particular, and they've found it liberating because now they understand themselves. Now they know what they've felt, they can actually attach it to something. And that's often the view that I take on labels when they're used to serve us as opposed to limit us.
Yeah, that's very relevant. And I think it's important to note, isn't it, when we look at autism, I think it's quite useful because they talk about it as a spectrum. So we know, and we have the understanding through the language that's used, that it can have differing degrees of severity, different ways of presenting, rather than one way. And I think that's the same with any grouping of people that we look at. People present in different ways, and they share with you what they want you to see.
Yes, that's right.
Yeah, and so many people over the years will, for example, pass in a workplace as being from a particular background or having certain experiences in life, but it may not be congruent with their lived experience. And again, I think this is something, again, we've touched on in earlier conversations, that when people join organisations or join a community, actually it's helpful to have that curiosity to say, what has been your experience to now?
Yes. I think it's really important to have those kind of conversations and to foster an environment that is safe. One of my most recent learnings, and that's making a massive difference in my life as a whole, is this understanding around psychological safety. And I think it's something that's, we're becoming more and more acutely aware of. And it's absolutely critical because it stems from childhood, how safe we felt as a child. That leads into how authentic we will then present ourselves to be, because if life is safe and everything's good, then I can just be me, it's fine. But if home isn't safe and I can't really be myself because I'm trying to survive, then that's likely to carry through throughout my life. So you can only imagine how that's compounded if the spaces and places that I go into, school and work, I feel again unsafe. So I feel an even greater need to wear this mask, and kind of links back to what I was saying before with this imposter syndrome and stuff like that. How am I going to then have what it takes to advocate for inclusion for people like me, whatever that people like me means? And that's why my company's called the Like Me CIC, because it's literally for people like me, whether that be ethnicity, women, whatever it be. How can I advocate for that when I'm actually struggling to embrace who I am? It takes a lot of boldness and courage to say, let's forge forward in this area and let's level this playing field. But if, for me, I don't even know if I'm okay within my own skin, that's a real big expectation to have. And until workplaces are spaces of psychological safety, we can't expect to get the best from those that we're working with. And then we're going to struggle to see that leveling up of the playing field and that inclusion that allows us to get the best from people.
Absolutely. And I talk about this a lot when I'm working with leaders, because one of the things that makes a workplace very much less inclusive, actually, is things like performance management culture. We all need to understand that people are performing to their goals. But when we've got bell curves, and I don't apologize for this, when we have the bell curves and we're literally telling people they're not good enough, and you're dealing with an individual maybe that's come from an environment where they felt that, and so they've now got perfectionist tendencies. The companies believe they're just doing something to manage salary, to stack and rank everybody, but actually what they're doing is so internally damaging to individuals. And this is why I think we see an increase now. Work-related stress is defined separately, exactly because we've created systems that don't create psychological safety.
Yeah, I'd agree with that. And a lot of it comes down to, just the skills. I've worked with REC to create a program for their management around kind of what we like to term as the soft skills. But I like Simon Sinek because he says what we consider soft skills, they're the real hard stuff, because it's the things of not just the technological abilities, actually how can you manage and lead people. Managing people, that's easier than leading people, because when you're leading people, you need to know the people that you're leading, what makes them tick, because you're actually trying to get the best out of these individuals. So if you're coming into a meeting to discuss performance and you are simply managing that person, you are exactly likely to do what you outlined there, which is just to feed into all of the limiting beliefs, all of the traumas and challenges and issues that they've faced in life. You're probably exacerbating that and probably sending that person into a state of, having more issues than helping them to identify what might not be working. Maybe, there's a performance thing here. We want you to be the best. How can we help you? What is going on, and creating that space so we can look at what really might be happening, because work, it's where we spend the vast majority of our time in a given week. But they actually do have a lot of other stuff going on in our life, which can still affect us because we are whole beings.
Yes.
The switching off what happens at home because now I'm in work mode, we can do that to a point, but we're whole beings. And so maybe my performance at work is reflecting something outside of work, but I still need that support because that will assist me. I looked at statistics around abuse, and it was said that abuse happens when someone's suffering from domestic abuse. It still can take place in the workplace. So in the car park or whatever else, the abusive partner might come and cause a scene and be intimidating and stuff like that. So if that's happening on the work ground, you can only imagine what the person might be dealing with outside of work. How's that going to impact them at work? So things, correlate. Illness, sickness that someone might be dealing with for a family member, not necessarily for themselves, but we're whole beings. And so I think it's really important that we look at the person as that and not simply focus on, right, you're here to do a job and that's it, because you don't get the best out of people if you treat them like that.
Absolutely, absolutely. And I think it should be part of the duty of care for employers. Now, my background on an industrial relations committee, I can remember a time when, shall we say, mental health was not particularly welcomed to be recognised within the workplace. Probably about 2015, when the IWD had their big launch on the Workplace Wellbeing Charter and mental health in the workplace. Prior to that, companies didn't seem to want to engage with it or recognise impact, because they genuinely felt they should be responsible for the individual for the time at work. Now, what complicates matters is obviously in 2020, we had COVID. So we had people in these situations, potentially, particularly call centre workers, people in banking sector, things like that, bringing their work into the home.
Yes.
And whereas work would have been perhaps that escape, that refuge, they are now in a situation where, without choice, without agency, they're having to bring their work into that environment, and that may be creating greater difficulties. And I think partially companies have had to come to recognise the need to have policies in place to be able to support people in that situation. Is this something that you've seen companies embracing more and being open to having conversations about through your work?
Yeah, definitely. COVID, I think, forced the issue, because that distinction between work and home was completely blurred because we were working at home. And so now my workspace is actually somewhere in my home environment, the work time. Unless it's someone that is, clocking in and clocking out, actually, when I do the work, might be a bit more flexible too. So yes, since COVID, I do think organizations have been forced to address. I remember looking at some statistics around, what are the things that organizations are looking for, and also what are people looking for in organizations. And people were kind of like a lot more attuned and a lot more honest about, actually, I want somewhere that supports my mental health. Stats show that organizations that are more supportive retain staff for so much longer than those that don't, and particularly with the Gen Z generation, they're wanting organizations that have a healthier encouragement of work-life balance. And for them, it's not so much about money. What else can you offer me to enrich my life, so that I can live a more enriched, authentic life? And so that has put places of work in it, sometimes quite a difficult predicament, because actually they're having to pull stuff out from where they've never had anything before, because they're being judged by new criteria. But I think we've seen a lot of positive change as a result of that, because organizations are seeking to do a better job of taking care of their staff, which is a good thing.
Yeah, I think we see a rise in transparency, particularly with things like Glassdoor, where employees will come, they will tell it as it is.
Yeah.
And so, that transparency now and the rise of social media has also fed into this accountability. For the organisations, though, that are doing it right, for me, what I see is a real rethinking of what reward and recognition means. As you say, driven by the millennials and the Gen Zs that want a different and also a more purpose-filled career. They're more driven by their values.
Right.
That's right. Than the individual enrichment. These are the generation that are pushing for sustainability, that are pushing for better recognition and equality in the workplace.
Yeah, so the kind of benefits packages where, you know, what do you do to support your staff? That's kind of really matters a lot more than ever before. It's not simply just, okay, what's the salary or the hourly rate?
Mm.
What other added benefits are there? And it reminds me of, there was an article that I read recently to the point where a young person was like, oh yeah, I've got like well-being days and I'm allowed to take these well-being days. And that was like one of the key deciding factors when looking for a role, because they're like, no, my well-being matters that much that I expect time to be allocated to it. And it made a huge difference. So yeah, I think these things do help level the playing field. You know, we're thinking primarily now, with it being International Women's Day, about leveling the playing field for us as women. But there's so many other areas. We're talking about mental health, and neurodiversity. You know, there's so many other areas that when we talk about leveling the playing field, it positively impacts on all of those. Just last week, I attended a session as I have managed to secure a bit of an opportunity working with the UN Women UK for their CSW 68. And they were saying that, you know, yes, we're called UN Women, but you know what? We want to level that playing field for everyone, actually.
Yes.
Because when we do, it makes things better for everyone, men included. So this isn't about, you know, leveling up for women to disadvantage men. It's just about, actually, let's all get better so it can be better for all. How can we do that? You know, what are those things that are being overlooked and undervalued currently, which quite often it's just some small changes that can be made. You know, more training for managers. I think 50% of managers, a statistic I read last year, 50% of managers get no training.
Correct.
50% of new managers. I mean, that's shocking. And then, you know, 50% of new managers are considered useless managers, which is not surprising, because if they're not being trained, typically you're promoted not because of your ability to lead and inspire, but because you're good at doing something that's quite often task oriented. You do that well, so you're promoted. And then you get to a certain level and you're expected to understand how to understand people, because that's effectively what leadership is.
Yeah, there's a big distinction between leadership and management. Yeah, leadership is, you know, taking the people with you. Management is managing the things that need to be done.
Yes.
But the fact that there is so little training, and I would say that that's a very conservative figure in my experience from companies that I've worked with internationally. You know, it is something that's expected to be known, but the biggest thing that people face challenges with, because actually when a manager doesn't feel equipped to open a frank conversation, and actually may feel that they're in a position of privilege in doing that as well, it sometimes just means the conversation doesn't even happen.
Right.
So going to that, for people, obviously your passion is about people advocating for themselves. How can we equip people as change makers, regardless of where they sit in an organization or a community, to speak up and show up for what they need, or for what they recognize others need in contributing to a more inclusive society?
It's about starting where you're at. Your social media, your blogs, you know, your website. Use your voice. I have a lunch and learn series called Empowering You, and this middle session, it's a 3-part one, it's all about your voice. And we often hear about finding your voice, and I'm like, no, I don't believe we find a voice. We have it. We just haven't learned how to use it, or we haven't given ourselves permission to use it. And so give ourselves permission to use our voice, whether that is, as I'm doing now, auditory kind of use of it, audibly, you know, using that voice, whether that's through writing, like I said, social media posts, blogs, articles, but use your voice. Speak your truth first and foremost, and then actually call out what it is that you see that you don't agree with. And again, that goes back to, you know, feeling safe to do so, because it does take a level of bravery to do that. But if you can join forces and find safe spaces and others that will stand with you, that helps. And I think what really empowers me is thinking about the next generation. So when I think about my daughter, the truth of the matter is some of the stuff that I might put up with for myself, I'm not going to tolerate for her. And so if we can do that, think about somebody else, it makes us stronger. And that's physiologically proven.
Yes.
Hold your hand out, press down, just thinking about how you benefit, your hand wavers more than thinking about others that benefit. Your hand is rock solid when they press down with the same amount of force, because actually we are wired for community and we are wired for significance and impact in the lives of others. So let's use that to our advantage. Let's harness that and think about the difference that we want to make. And I committed to living full and dying empty. And so, you know, what does that mean for me? It might mean something different for you, but committing to living your life as opposed to existing it, I think goes a long way, because then you're like, actually, I want to stand for something. What is it that I want to stand for? What cause do I think is worth fighting? And then making sure in whatever way that we can do. Me, it means this year I joined UN Women. So I can hear some discussions and I can be a part of something I didn't even know was possible until a short while ago, you know, but it's just being open to making our voices heard.
Yeah. And that's a very big step for people who perhaps have not felt that they have the right to speak up.
Yes.
Now, I'm a firm believer everybody has a purpose, has something that they can do, something that they can contribute. And it's finding that meaning that is greater than yourself, that gives the energy to drive these things forward. And obviously, finding your community, finding your collaborators, this is the thing that really makes the difference and powers things moving forward. I mean, obviously, as we've seen generationally, things shift as more people come towards and vocalize their way of thinking. If we look at things like the inclusion and diversity agenda, if we look at things like the Sustainable Development Goals and that agenda and the UN agenda, these are all things that have taken many, many collective voices to advance the changes that we see in environments, in companies, in legislation. It should be to support people. But it all starts with individual voices. When I work with corporates, I always say to people, the corporates are not the bad guys. There is no they, because it's made up of a collective of individuals.
That's right.
And if those individuals feel safe and they feel loved rather than fearful, that they belong, happy and secure, then they'll be able to create great things.
That's right. That's right. So it's about recognizing that we can all make a difference when we come together.
Absolutely. Absolutely. So what would you like to be your closing message for those listening to our interview today?
I think it's really important that we recognize that, first of all, it starts with me. So you mentioned about the courage that it takes actually to use our voices to speak up and to speak out. And so I encourage individuals to develop themselves, to empower themselves, because it starts with me, it starts with you. And then in doing so, as you empower yourself, you can then have enough in your cup, you know, enough in here to then let it flow out into others, so that you can then seek to empower others, to collaborate and connect with others and create a more empowered environment and space to make that change. So it starts with you, let it flow out and go out into the world. And then I think it all comes back to us as individuals as well.
Wonderful. Well, thank you so much for your time. I will share your links when I share the interviews. But it's been a real privilege to speak with you. Thank you.
Thank you, Laura. It's been wonderful. Thanks very much.